Hello everyone, welcome to Festival Nauki, the 2020 edition. My name is Aneta Dybska. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of English Studies, the University of Warsaw. Today, in my brief presentation, I'm going to talk to you about American urban utopias. Let's begin by defining the word utopia. What is a utopia? What are the functions of utopia? Who is involved in utopian thinking? An answer that immediately would come to one's mind would be that utopia is a perfect place. It's an ideal place. But also, many would say that a utopia is a place that does not exist. The term utopia was first used in the early 16th century, and it seems like it's a combination of two different words coming from Greek language. One of those words would be utopia, meaning good place, and the other word would be utopia, meaning no place, a place that does not exist. So utopia, in its contemporary meaning and its most commonsensical understanding, is a good place that existed nowhere except in the imagination. The word utopia was used for the first time by Sir Thomas More in his political treatise titled Utopia, which was published in Latin in 1516. Sir Thomas More was a Catholic statesman, lawyer and scholar, Lord Chancellor to King Henry VIII, and when King Henry VIII decided to break from the Catholic Church, Sir Thomas More strongly opposed. He didn't endorse this decision, and it's because of this that he was executed. Thomas More's Utopia is obviously a criticism of Tudor England, but it's also a way to talk about alternatives to a social and political order that could bring more equality and justice the way Thomas More imagined it. Thomas More's Utopia is about an imaginary island nation where people are happy, living more or less an urban/agricultural life. This is a society where common property is the norm, meaning there is no private property. So people live in homes, 2- or 3-story homes. Behind houses that they live in, there are gardens where inhabitants of Utopia grow fruit, vegetables, where they grow the vines, different kinds of flowers. In other words, there is more or less a harmony, the way Thomas More imagined it in pre-industrial 16th century Europe, where people usually have a trade. Some of them can be masons, some of them can be smiths, others could be carpenters, and still others would be manufacturers of wool or flax. Other than that, this utopian society is a place of equality, and this equality is rooted in lack of private property, but also in the fact that all people have jobs and they are productive members of the society, and they have gardens with which they produce all the necessary things that they bring to the marketplace to share with others. So as you will see, there is no currency. There is more or less a share economy where people come to one place to exchange goods, and also outside the city, in close vicinity to the city, we have agricultural farms where all members from the early childhood are taught to cultivate vegetables. So this is more or less what we would today call a self-sustaining community, self-sustaining cities that are ecological, where there is no carbon footprint, where there is very little hierarchy, if any. And of course this leads me to another aspect of utopia, which from today's point of view is a society that has got slaves and is a society that is built on a more superior position of man. So after this brief introduction into utopia as a non-existing, an ideal, a perfect place that is usually imagined, conceived as an alternative to the status quo, let's talk about the American Republic and elements of utopian thinking that we can see, trace, detect in American philosophy, political philosophy, in the way American cities develop after the Revolutionary War in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, beginning with a well-known tension, a tension that is not unique to the United States, but a tension that is absolutely relevant to an understanding of a certain idealism that is invested in America as a political utopian project. So the early 18th century is the time when American politicians, intellectual elites, people of affluence, educated men, diplomats, start thinking of America as a unique political project that has, for the first time ever, become independent of Europe and European powers and imperial interests. So what we observe is a kind of a tension and a conflict between two opposing, as if, roads or solutions to America's future growth. And this is where utopian thinking comes into play a lot. I'm going to just briefly highlight what is really happening, geographically speaking, in the American South, which is predominantly agrarian. It's there where we have large plantations that use slave labor, and this is a very powerful local, national, but also element of a global economy that gives wealth and affluence not only to southern plantation owners, but to America as a new country that has suffered expenses because of the war, that has to think of itself as an important player in global politics. On the other hand, we have new forces emerging in the north, and this is where we can observe and notice the highest numbers of immigrants and migrants from within the rural areas coming to work and showing an interest in manufacturing work. Many business-minded investors, charitable men start up businesses that contribute to America's industrial wealth. And by that I mean predominantly textile mills, similar to those in Łódź and Żyrardów in mid-19th century in Poland, where mostly rural girls find jobs away from the countryside where they used to live. So what we can see is a discussion taking place in the American society about the direction, about the future of America, that in many letters of the period is imagined as a garden. And many opponents of industrial growth, especially those who want America to be this unique enterprise, they don't want America to be a copycat of what's already happening in Europe. They think of industry and manufacturing as a snake in the Garden of Eden. These are exactly the words that Thomas Jefferson, a large plantation owner, a Virginian, a slave owner, a politician, a would-be president, expressed in his writings titled Notes on the State of Virginia. The early years of the American Republic are marked by urban growth, so we can obviously say that the development of the United States of America, spatial, geographical, industrial, administrative, is very much linked to the emergence of towns and cities and metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas which are very much connected to the development of industry in the American North. New York is a very good example of a Republican spatial imagination. This is how scholars refer to New York's spatial, economic, and political growth in the early decades of the 19th century. If we look at the map of New York dating back to the Revolution era, we can see that only the most southern tip of Manhattan was inhabited, was developed, and what we can read from the map is the city's a kind of organic growth, natural growth and expansion with very narrow and winding streets, and this layout, this grid of streets resembling more of a countryside than the city. On the right-hand side, we have a much later map, plan of New York that, as you see at first sight, you already see the difference in the layout of the streets. Urban scholars today see this as a perfect example of the grid with rectangular blocks that are equal, non-hierarchical, as an example of Republican ideals used in urban planning. This exemplifies a kind of a utopian thinking about the city as a space that has no hierarchies, of the American city and its citizens who are equal, who have the same rights. There is no one else beyond or above them, and the space is treated here in a very utilitarian way. There's kind of a division of a space into rectangular blocks, makes them attractive from the point of view of real estate. Scholars, urban planners, intellectuals and reformers praised the grid. They praised the grid as this very modern, progressive solution that in itself was the embodiment of American ideals of equality. The industrial city, the mid-19th century American metropolis, is a place full of contrasts. On the one hand, we have the industrial class, the class of wealthy, affluent industrialists and businessmen. On the other hand, we have masses, literally masses of European immigrants coming to the industrial cities in search of a better life and opportunities. Urban scholars point to the emergence of a new urban form in the late 19th century, something that scholar Robert Fishman calls Bourgeois Utopias. These are suburban settlements inhabited, designed and planned in terms of the house, but also the surroundings, the immediate natural environment from scratch, as an antithesis of, as a complete opposite of the industrial city and the horrors that the city represents to them. Running away from the filth and the dirt and overcrowding of the industrial city, a city that as if cannot be controlled, a city that is such a gross kind of departure from the early ideals of the American Republic. They erect huge mansions in the countryside that is connected to the metropolitan areas by the railroad. Bourgeois utopias, that is the suburban settlements established by the affluent Americans in the late 19th century, are anti-urban. What does it mean? Well, one way to explain this would be to say that they lack an organic wholeness, a diversity of functions and spaces that the city offers, and the functions that it performs within the city as a living organism characterized by diversity, different kinds of productivity, contact and communication and exchange. So with regard to that kind of an understanding of urban space or the city as a place that is very vibrant and thriving, the suburban space is very much unlike the industrial city. The bourgeois utopia is designed completely from scratch, built on an open space with single-family homes being surrounded by huge commons and tree-lined boulevards and curving streets and streams and hills, all of this completely artificially created in search for a better place, a good place, in search of utopia. So running away from the urban city, the wealthy and the affluent treat their suburban home, the suburban mansion, as an equivalent of, as something similar to a medieval castle. And the home becomes this most sacred place, even a place superior to that of a place of prayer. We have to point out that what is happening in the suburban areas is the so-called self-segregation. The middle-class bourgeois Americans are self-segregating themselves spatially. This leads to what Robert Fishman refers to as middle-class alienation. And being mindful of gender differences, the men usually being the breadwinners and the women fulfilling the role of mothers and housewives, middle-class women as mothers, are becoming segregated from the world of the city, the world of power and productivity. So far, we have talked about the grid and bourgeois utopias as examples of utopian thinking in American urban planning. An outstanding example of a prophetic, futuristic vision of America's future is Frank Lloyd Wright's design of the Broadacre city. By the 1930s, the American society has severely felt the consequences of the Great Depression, and Frank Lloyd Wright himself, who had designed homes for very affluent Americans in bourgeois utopias, creates a vision of an alternative society, a Usonian society, the US standing for United States of America society. This vision is very much a vision of America's regional development, which is, to start with, superior compared to the chaotic growth of the 19th century American city and its suburban development. For the first time ever, Americans are lured by the possibilities offered by the car. So Frank Lloyd Wright himself was absolutely fascinated and drawn to those technological advancements and possibilities that the car offered. Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre city, as you can see in the picture, is very much a large-scale project of regional development where we cannot really see a center surrounded by peripheries. Rather, this is a vision of decentralized America, of sprawling suburban landscape, which is a new urban landscape. What happens is Frank Lloyd Wright brings together a vision of rural and urban development in one place, a place that, unlike the capitalist city, which has its flaws, which has shown to be very ruthless during the Depression era to average Americans, this is a democratic space characterized by individual freedoms and individuals' equal access to land. This is a project that stresses very much private property which is affordable, which somehow resonates with the needs of individual Americans, but a project which at its core stresses democratic freedoms and only later puts an emphasis on equality as this second value that American democracy is founded upon. Broadacre City is designed for the American society, the Usonian society, as a nation that is very much a nation of landowners and farmers. So this vision, bringing together the urban and rural lifestyle, is a movement away and a progression towards the regional development of America, that takes the best what we have in the city and takes the best what we have in the suburban landscape and merges these two qualities. So in Frank Lloyd Wright's plan of the Broadacre city, the one that we can see in the picture, numerous functions within the city laid out on a grid. We have those rectangular blocks dividing space equally. We have spaces that are not organized around a central core. As you can see, in the very center we have homes that are small size, medium size, and in the top right hand corner we have larger homes. Around those homes we have cultural centers, office buildings, small farms, markets, small industry. But if you look at this as an example of the city of the future, as a vision of the city of the future, Frank Lloyd Wright very much gives up on the metropolitan center as the core of all activities. He is into putting into space, implementing, projecting onto space this ideal of democracy as he understood it, the single family or single family homestead being a basic social unit. It's a very important statement and assumption made during the Depression era, that a single family would be both an intellectual and a productive manufacturing unit. Frank Lloyd Wright's The Broadacre City seems to have been a major inspiration for Norman Bel Geddes, a designer who was commissioned by General Motors to prepare an exhibit for the New York World Fair in 1939. This exhibit is called and well known to scholars and students of urban studies as the Futurama exhibit. The Futurama exhibit was a dioramic picture, as you can see in the pictures in the slides, that was taking the Americans of the late 30s on a journey into the future, as into the world of tomorrow as imagined by its designer, Norman Bel Geddes. Norman Bel Geddes was very much influenced by, it seems so, by Frank Lloyd Wright's The Broadacre City and this vision of the American urban landscape sprawling, being decentralized, organized around a free flow of cars. The flow of cars that was taking place along major arterial highways connecting the regional grid of broadacre settlements in with the larger metropolitan center. The skyscrapers that we see in the diorama, in the dioramic picture, are designed as sustainable buildings that have landing sites on the rooftops, and they are surrounded by lush green areas that very much resemble Le Corbusier's European design of the radiant city. America's post-World War II suburban development seems to have been very much influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of the Broadacre city and Usonian homes and Usonian society, as much as by the futuristic vision projected in the Futurama exhibit during the 1939 World Fair. Post-World War II suburbs are for many Americans, especially white Americans, the Euro-ethnics, a fulfillment of the American dream, a dream that is made possible because of a broad accessibility of cars, and also it's made possible because of certain incentives and help from the federal government and the legislation that makes it possible for average Americans to become homeowners. So if we think of this idea of equal access to land and property, and all Americans having houses in the Broadacre city, Frank Wright's vision of a democratic society is very much implemented by the federal government. What we know today, and there's extensive research on the post-World War II suburbs, is that the suburbs are not available to people of color. This prompts us to reconsider the history of America's suburban development and the very fact of the suburbs being part of a larger utopian vision. What kind of utopia are we talking about? What kind of a perfect society are we dealing with? Is this a society that is built on race and racial segregation as a major source of happiness? Is this a society that allows individual Americans who happen to be white to make decisions about where they want to live and what neighbors they want to have? Although the post-World War II suburbs had a very important function, they fulfilled a very important social function of upward mobility. They catered to an average American who was in need of housing. They were far from perfect. And by the 1980s, a group of urban planners and architects created the so-called New Urbanism, a new approach to suburban development, which was the way the majority of Americans lived in the suburbs. So New Urbanism is a way of making this good project of Americans living the American dream, having a house and owning a car, of retrofitting the suburbia, of adjusting them, of remodeling the suburbs to fulfill the requirements of today. One of the major criticisms directed at the suburbs in the post-World War II period was that the suburbs were not really urban villages as some visionaries would have wanted them to be, or had designed them to be, combining precisely this urban and rural function. So far from urban villages, they became alienating places where individual families felt estranged from one another, where, as scholars who were doing research, especially sociologists, working with suburban populations, they noticed that something has gone wrong with the people losing a sense of community, not having any bonds tying them into a community. So New Urbanism is a direct response to that kind of disappearance of the communal fabric and communal life that was part of the traditional city in the industrial period. So New Urbanism is focused on creating the hustle and bustle of small town living. These communities are much denser and more complete in terms of the range of functions that they fulfill. So in this, they resemble Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre city. We have commercial, educational, recreational, multiple functions fulfilled by the suburban areas today in this retrofitted fashion, and these are usually walkable communities. So we can see a movement away from the car as a major means of transportation, and people in this movement towards the creation of sustainable communities, ecologically friendly communities, relying more on public transportation and being interested and making an investment in public spaces and communication, interaction and contact. Now that we have arrived at the end of my presentation, I'd like to give you a brief overview of major themes and ideas I covered in my mini lecture. American urban utopias are, to start with, a critique of the existing society, but also they are an attempt at creating a perfect society rooted in new ideals. In the case of the United States and American urban projects, these would be the parallel ideals of freedom and equality. Once again, thank you for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed other lectures offered by the Institute of English Studies faculty as part of Festival Nauki 2020. Thank you.